The world is loud, but my world is silent. In my world, the only sound that matters is the heartbeat of a machine. Tick, tick, tick. It is a steady, rhythmic pulse that does not lie, does not cheat, and does not leave you behind. I sat hunched over my workbench, the magnifying loupe pressed tight against my right eye. The light from the desk lamp was a focused cone of yellow warmth in the otherwise cold, dim room. My apartment was small, barely larger than a closet, smelling of old oil, brass, and dust. But it was mine. Under my fingers, 100-year-old pocket watch lay disassembled. It was a mess of gears and springs, a chaotic puzzle that someone else had given up on. To them, it was broken. To me, it was just waiting to be heard. I picked up a pair of tweezers, my hand steady. I held my breath. This was the moment of truth. I placed the tiny balance wheel back into its housing. With a gentle nudge, I set it in motion. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the magic returned. The wheel swung back and forth. The pallet fork clicked. The heart began to beat again. I exhaled, a long, slow breath of satisfaction. I was not a rich man. I was Elias Thorne, a 32-year-old man with grease under his fingernails and holes in his sweaters. But in moments like this, I felt like a god. I could fix things. I could reverse time. I could make the broken whole again. My phone buzzed on the edge of the table, shattering the piece. The vibration caused a tiny screw to dance across the wood. I frowned, peeling the loupe from my eye. The screen showed a number I did not recognize, but the area code belonged to the city's financial district. A place I avoided. A place where time was money, not art. I wiped my hands on a rag and answered. "Elias Thorne speaking," I said, my voice rough from disuse. I hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days. "Mr. Thorne," a voice replied. It was dry, crisp, and devoid of any warmth. It sounded like sandpaper on stone. "This is Edward Sterling from the legal firm of Sterling and Associates. I am calling regarding your father, Arthur Thorne." My chest tightened. I looked at the watch on the table, still ticking away. My father, the great Arthur Thorne, the man who built an empire of time, the man who hadn't called me on my birthday in 10 years. "What about him?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. You don't get calls from lawyers on a Tuesday afternoon for good news. "I regret to inform you," the lawyer said, his tone not changing a single octave, "that your father passed away early this morning. A massive cardiac arrest. It was instant." The world didn't stop. The watch on my desk didn't stop. It just kept ticking. Tick, tick, tick. But the air in the room suddenly felt very thin. My father was dead. The man I had spent my entire childhood trying to impress. The man whose shadow was so large it had swallowed me whole, was gone. I waited for the tears. I waited for the sobbing breakdown that I had seen in movies. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange hollow ache in the center of my stomach. It was the feeling of a door being slammed shut before you could say goodbye. "Elias, are you still there?" the lawyer asked. "I'm here," I whispered. "The funeral is scheduled for Friday. The reading of the will take place immediately after at the Thorne estate. Your presence is expected." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "Your stepmother, Isabella, and your brother Julian asked me to convey the message. They are too distraught to call themselves." I almost laughed. Distraught? Isabella probably was already calculating how this would affect the quarterly earnings. Julian was probably worried about whether he could still throw his yacht party next weekend. They weren't distraught. They were busy. "I'll be there," I said, and hung up. I sat there for a long time. The watch continued its rhythmic march. I looked at the mechanical heart I had just fixed. I had saved this machine, but I hadn't been able to save the relationship with the man who taught me how to fix it. The drive to the Thorne estate 2 days later was a journey through layers of my own inadequacy. I drove my battered sedan, the engine coughing as it climbed the winding hills outside the city. The landscape changed from grey concrete to lush green manicured lawns. The iron gates of the estate loomed like the entrance to a fortress. I punched in the code. My birthday surprisingly still worked, and the gates swung open with a groan. The driveway was a mile long, lined with ancient oak trees that my father had loved. He used to tell me that trees were the only things that understood time better than watches. "They don't count the seconds, Elias," he would say. "They just grow." As I approached the main house, the familiar knot of anxiety returned. The mansion was a sprawling monstrosity of stone and glass, a testament to wealth and power. The driveway was already filled with black luxury cars. A valet in a pristine uniform looked at my rusted sedan with poorly concealed disgust as I rolled to a stop. "I'll park it myself," I muttered, driving past him to a side lot near the servants' entrance. I didn't belong in the front row. I never had. I walked to the front door, adjusting the collar of my only suit. It was black, slightly too tight in the shoulders, and smelled faintly of mothballs. I took a deep breath and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The foyer was filled with people. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. A low hum of conversation floated around the high ceilings. These were the elite: business partners, investors, socialites. They held crystal glasses and spoke in hushed tones, not about the man who died, but about the vacuum he left behind. "Elias?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the noise. I turned to see Isabella descending the grand staircase. She was dressed in impeccable mourning black, a veil stylishly pinned to her hair. She looked like a queen in a tragedy, beautiful and cold. She didn't look like a widow. She looked like the new owner. "Isabella," I said, nodding. She stopped on the last step, looking me up and down. Her eyes lingered on my scuffed shoes. "You came," she said, her voice flat. "We weren't sure if you would. Julian bet against it." "He always was a gambling man," I replied quietly. "He's in the library with the board members," she said, dismissing my comment. "Try not to embarrass us today, Elias. The press is outside. Stock prices are sensitive to instability. The last thing we need is the prodigal son looking like a beggar." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and floated away into the crowd, accepting condolences with a practiced grace. I stood there, feeling the familiar sting of invisibility. I was the ghost in this house. I wandered through the halls. I saw Julian near the fireplace. He was holding a glass of scotch, his face flushed. He was 5 years younger than me, taller, more handsome, and infinitely more confident. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my car. He was laughing at something a senator was saying. Laughing. At his father's wake. When he saw me, his smile didn't fade. It just turned sharp. "Elias," he called out, waving me over. The circle of powerful men parted to let me in. Look who crawled out of his hole. Gentlemen, this is my half-brother, the hermit. The men chuckled politely. Julian draped an arm around my shoulder. It felt heavy and fake. Still fixing clocks in that basement, brother? Or have you moved on to toasters? Still watches, Julian, I said, shrugging his arm off. Someone has to care about quality. Julian's eyes narrowed, but he kept the smile plastered on his face. Quality, he scoffed. That's a word for people who can't afford innovation. Dad knew that. That's why he put me in charge of sales. We sell the future, Elias. You're stuck in the past. I didn't argue. There was no point. I walked away, finding a quiet corner near the window. Outside, the sky was turning a bruised purple. Rain began to tap against the glass. I pressed my hand against the cold pane. This was the house where I learned to walk. This was the house where my mother had died when I was 7. This was the house where my father had retreated into his workshop, leaving me with nannies and, eventually, Isabella. I felt a profound sense of loss, not just for my father, but for the family I never really had. The funeral service was a blur. Speeches were made by people who barely knew him. They talked about his vision, his empire, his legacy. No one talked about how he liked his coffee black with 2 sugars. No one talked about how he would hum off-key when he was working on a difficult gear train. No one talked about the man. They only worshipped the monument. I stood at the back, the rain soaking through my thin suit, watching the mahogany casket being lowered into the ground. I didn't throw a flower. I just whispered, "Goodbye, Dad." After the service, the inner circle gathered in the grand library for the reading of the will. The room was lined with books that had never been read. A fire crackled in the hearth, offering no real warmth. Mr. Sterling, the lawyer, sat behind my father's massive desk. Isabella sat in a velvet armchair, sipping water. Julian leaned against the mantel, looking bored. I took a wooden chair in the corner. "Shall we begin?" Mr. Sterling asked, opening a leather-bound folder. The tension in the room shifted. This was the main event. This was what they were really here for. The grief was over. Now came the greed. Arthur Thorne was a man of specific intent, Sterling began. His last will and testament was updated 6 months ago. Isabella straightened up. Julian stopped checking his phone. First, Sterling read, "To my wife, Isabella Thorne. I leave the Thorne estate, including the mansion, the grounds, and all personal property contained within, excluding the items specifically mentioned later. I also leave her 40% of the voting shares in Thorne Sons." Isabella let out a breath she had been holding. She nodded, her face composed, but her eyes gleaming. She had the house. She had the power. "To my son, Julian Thorne," Sterling continued. "I leave my collection of vintage automobiles, the penthouse in Manhattan, and 40% of the voting shares in Thorne Sons. Furthermore, I appoint Julian as the acting CEO, effective immediately." Julian pumped his fist silently. "Yes," he hissed. He looked at me with a smirk. "Did you hear that, Elias? CEO. The old man finally made the right call." I felt a numbness spreading through my limbs. 80% of the company, the house, the cars, everything. They had everything. I didn't want the money. I truly didn't. But the exclusion felt like a slap in the face. It was a confirmation that I didn't belong. "And finally," Sterling said, his voice dropping a decibel. He looked over his glasses at me. "To my eldest son, Elias Thorne." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Julian and Isabella turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of pity and amusement. They expected me to get a token, maybe a cash sum, maybe a car. Furthermore, I appoint Julian as the acting CEO, effective immediately. Julian pumped his fist silently. Yes, he hissed. He looked at me with a smirk. Did you hear that, Elias? CEO. The old man finally made the right call. I felt a numbness spreading through my limbs. 80% of the company, the house, the cars, everything. They had everything. I didn't want the money, I truly didn't. But the exclusion felt like a slap in the face. It was a confirmation that I didn't belong. And finally, Sterling said, his voice dropping a decibel. He looked over his glasses at me. To my eldest son, Elias Thorne. The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling. Julian and Isabella turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of pity and amusement. They expected me to get a token, maybe a cash sum, maybe a car. I leave the property located at Blackwood Ridge, Sterling read. Blackwood Ridge? Julian laughed. You mean the old cabin in the woods? The one Dad used as a shed? It's a ruin. It's miles from civilization. Silence, please, Sterling commanded. He continued reading. I leave the Blackwood Ridge property and the contents of the workshop therein. Additionally, I leave to Elias my personal project box, currently located in my safe. Sterling reached under the desk and pulled out a small, battered wooden box. He stood up and walked over to me, handing it over. It was heavy. The wood was stained and scratched. That's it? Julian asked, incredulous. A shack and a box of junk. No shares? No money? No financial assets were allocated to Elias Thorne, Sterling confirmed. Isabella let out a small, cruel laugh. Well, she said, standing up and smoothing her dress, it seems Arthur knew who was capable of leading this family and who wasn't. Elias, you're welcome to stay for dinner, but I assume you'll want to head out to your estate. I stared at the box in my hands. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. My eyes were burning. It wasn't about the money. It was the message. My father had left them the empire. He had left me a ruin. He had looked at his two sons and decided that one was a king and the other was a peasant. I'll be going, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I stood up, clutching the box to my chest like a shield. I walked out of the library, past the servants who averted their eyes, past the portraits of my ancestors who seemed to glare at me. I walked out into the rain. I got into my car and sat there, the engine cold. I looked at the box. With trembling fingers, I opened the lid. Inside, nestled in velvet that had been eaten away by moths, was a pocket watch. But it wasn't a masterpiece. It was a disaster. The face was cracked. The casing was tarnished silver, almost black with oxidation. The hands were bent. It didn't tick. It was dead weight. Underneath the watch was a note. I unfolded it. It was my father's handwriting, messy and spiked. For Elias, because you like to fix broken things. That was it. No, I love you. No, I'm proud of you. Just a description of my life. You like to fix broken things. I slammed the steering wheel with my fist. A scream tore from my throat, raw and animalistic. Tears finally came, hot and angry. Why? I shouted at the empty car. Why did you hate me so much? I looked up at the mansion. The lights were blazing. I could see silhouettes moving in the windows. They were celebrating. They had won. They had stripped everything away. I was the eldest son, and I was leaving with nothing but a box of trash and a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I started the car. The headlights cut through the rain. I wasn't going back to my apartment. I couldn't. The rent was due next week, and I had spent my savings on the suit and the gas. I had nowhere else to go. I had to go to Blackwood Ridge. I had to go to the ruin. The drive took 3 hours. The paved roads turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt. The forest closed in around the car, the trees tall and imposing in the darkness. Blackwood Ridge was an isolated patch of land deep in the mountains. My father had bought it 40 years ago when he was just starting out. He hadn't been there in decades. I arrived at the clearing. The headlights illuminated the cabin. It was worse than Julian had described. The roof was sagging. The windows were boarded up. Vines had overtaken the front porch. It looked like a dying beast that had collapsed in the woods. I killed the engine. The silence of the forest was absolute. No city hum, no distant sirens, just the wind in the trees and the rain on the roof. I grabbed the wooden box and my small suitcase. I kicked the front door open. It gave way with a screech of rusty hinges. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and abandonment. I used the flashlight on my phone to look around. There was a single room, a cot in the corner with a bare mattress, a wood stove covered in cobwebs, and in the center of the room, a heavy workbench. I walked over to the workbench. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. I wiped it away with my sleeve. The wood beneath was scarred and stained with ink and oil. This was where my father had started, before the millions, before the fame. He had sat here. I placed the wooden box on the bench. I took out the broken watch. I held it up to the light. It was heavy, heavier than any watch I had ever held. It felt dense, useless, just like me. I whispered. I raised my hand, ready to throw the watch against the wall. I wanted to smash it. I wanted to break the last thing he gave me. I wanted to hurt him back. My arm tensed. I swung my arm forward, but I stopped. My thumb had brushed against the back of the watch case. It wasn't smooth. There was a groove, a hidden catch. I lowered my arm. I brought the watch closer to my eyes. I wiped the tarnish with my thumb. There was a tiny indentation, almost invisible to the naked eye. But I wasn't using the naked eye. I was using the touch of a watchmaker. I knew metal. I knew how it breathed. I pressed my thumbnail into the groove. Click! I placed the wooden box on the bench. I took out the broken watch. I held it up to the light. It was heavy, heavier than any watch I had ever held. It felt dense, useless, just like me, I whispered. I raised my hand, ready to throw the watch against the wall. I wanted to smash it. I wanted to break the last thing he gave me. I wanted to hurt him back. My arm tensed. I swung my arm forward, but I stopped. My thumb had brushed against the back of the watch case. It wasn't smooth. There was a groove, a hidden catch. I lowered my arm. I brought the watch closer to my eyes. I wiped the tarnish with my thumb. There was a tiny indentation, almost invisible to the naked eye. But I wasn't using the naked eye. I was using the touch of a watchmaker. I knew metal. I knew how it breathed. I pressed my thumbnail into the groove. Click! The back of the case didn't just open, It sprang open with a force that surprised me. It wasn't a simple hinge, it was a mechanism. I looked at the inside of the case back. There was an engraving. The metal was bright and untarnished there, protected from the world for who knows how long, for the only one who knows how to fix it. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the movement of the watch exposed now. It was impossible. I had seen thousands of watches. I knew every caliber, every escapement, every complication from the last 2 centuries. But this was a labyrinth. The gears were stacked in layers I couldn't comprehend. There were wheels that seemed to float. It wasn't just broken, it was a riddle. I sat down on the dusty floor, the cold seeping into my bones. The anger began to drain away, replaced by a sudden intense curiosity. My father hadn't just given me a broken watch. He had given me a challenge. Outside, the storm raged. The wind howled like a grieving spirit. But inside the cabin, I was frozen in place. I looked around the dark, rotting room. They thought they had taken everything. They thought they had left me with nothing. I looked down at the complex metal heart in my hand. For the first time since I got the phone call, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a watchmaker. And I had work to do. Morning came not with the warmth of the sun, but with the piercing cold that seeped through the floorboards. I woke up shivering on the bare mattress, my breath forming little ghosts in the air. For a moment, just a split second between sleep and wakefulness, I thought I was back in my apartment. I reached out for the bedside lamp, but my hand hit the rough, splintered wood of the floor. Reality crashed down on me. I wasn't in the city. I was in a rotting cabin in Blackwood Ridge. I was the disinherited son of a dead billionaire. I sat up, groaning as my stiff muscles protested. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt physical. Sunlight sliced through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I looked at the workbench. The watch was exactly where I had left it. It wasn't a dream. The puzzle was real. My stomach growled, a loud, angry sound that echoed in the empty room. Survival first, mysteries later. I spent the next 3 hours doing the kind of manual labor I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I found a rusty axe in the corner and chopped fallen branches for the wood stove. I located a hand pump for water outside, clearing away the dead leaves and priming it until clear, freezing water gushed out. I drove to the nearest town, a 40-minute trek down a treacherous dirt road, and bought canned beans, instant coffee, cleaning supplies, and a generator. When I returned, the cabin looked less like a tomb and more like a bunker. I scrubbed the years of grime off the floor. I tore the rotting curtains down. I set up the generator around the back, the hum of the engine, a comforting modern noise in the ancient woods. I was reclaiming this space. My father might have left me a ruin, but I was a restorer. I didn't throw things away, I fixed them. By late afternoon, I was ready to face the workbench. I set up 2 bright LED lamps, their white light flooding the scarred wooden surface. I pulled up a stool and sat down. It was just me and the watch. "All right," I whispered. "Show me what you are." I put on my loop. Under magnification, the damage was even worse than I had thought. The balance staff was shattered. The mainspring was snapped in 3 places. But as I dismantled it piece by piece, laying the tiny components out on a velvet mat, I realized something strange. The parts weren't standard. Usually, watch movements are like varied dialects of the same language. You have the Swiss style, the German style, the Japanese style. But this was a language I had never heard. The gear teeth were cut at angles I hadn't seen in textbooks. The bridges, the plates that hold the gears in place, weren't just functional. They were carved with microscopic patterns that looked like topographical maps. I picked up a gear the size of a ladybug. It was made of an alloy I couldn't identify. It was lighter than titanium, but harder than steel. My father hadn't just bought parts for this watch. He had invented them. A sudden realization hit me. I turned to the wooden box the lawyer had given me, the box of junk Julian had laughed at. I dumped it out onto the floor. Dozens of small metal containers clattered onto the wood. I opened one. It contained springs. I opened another. It contained screws, but not normal screws. These had triangular heads. I laughed. It was a dry, incredulous sound. Julian had the millions. He had the factories. He had the brand. But he didn't have the spare parts. My father had left me the only inventory in the world that could fix this specific machine. It wasn't a box of trash. It was a supply drop. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, in the glass and steel tower of Thorne Sons, the air was conditioned, filtered, and scented with ambition. Julian sat in our father's chair. It was too big for him. He had to keep adjusting his posture to look authoritative. Across the desk sat Marcus Vance, the head of engineering. Marcus was an old-school watchmaker, a man who had worked with my father for 30 years. He looked tired. "The Legacy 2.0 launch is scheduled for next month, Julian," Marcus said, tapping a tablet. "But we have a problem. The new supplier for the escapements, the quality isn't there. The tolerance is off by 3 microns. Julian waved his hand dismissively. He was busy looking at the engagement metrics on his latest Instagram post about becoming CEO. 3 microns, Marcus? No one cares about 3 microns. Can the customer see it? No, but does it stop the watch from telling time? Eventually, yes. In maybe 3 or 4 years, the friction will... 3 or 4 years, Julian interrupted, leaning forward. By then, they'll want the Legacy 3.0. Listen, Marcus. Dad was a genius, but he was obsessed. He spent millions on details nobody noticed. That's why margins were down. I promised the board a 20% increase in profit this quarter. We stick with the cheaper supplier. Marcus tightened his jaw. Arthur would never have approved this. The Thorne name means something because it lasts forever. If we sell these, we are selling ticking time bombs. The Thorne name means what I say it means, Julian snapped. His voice lost its smooth veneer. I am the CEO. I am the majority shareholder. And I say we ship. Are we clear? Marcus stared at him for a long moment. He looked at the portrait of my father hanging on the wall behind Julian. The painted eyes seemed to be looking away in shame. Crystal clear, Mr. Thorne, Marcus said quietly, standing up. As Marcus left, Isabella walked in. She was holding a glass of champagne. Celebrating already? She asked. Just establishing the new world order, Julian said, spinning in the chair. Marcus is a dinosaur. We need to purge the old guard. They're too attached to Dad's ghost. Isabella walked to the window, looking out over the city. Speaking of ghosts, she said, I had the estate manager check on the Blackwood property, just to make sure Elias isn't causing trouble. And? He's there, living in that hovel. Apparently he bought a generator and some beans. He's playing survivor. Julian laughed. Let him play. He'll last a month. Then he'll come crawling back, begging for a job in the mailroom. And I'll enjoy saying no. Isabella took a sip of her drink. Her eyes were cold calculations. We should keep an eye on him, Julian. Your father was eccentric, but he wasn't stupid. Giving Elias that land, it bothers me. It's useless land, yes, but why keep it for 40 years? Sentimental value, Julian shrugged. It's where he started. He probably wanted Elias to feel connected to his roots. It's a poetic insult, Mother. Don't overthink it. I always overthink, Isabella said softly. That's how I survive. Back in the cabin, the night had fallen again. I had spent 6 hours organizing the parts. I was exhausted, my eyes burning, but my mind was racing. I had identified about 60% of the components needed to repair the watch. The other 40% were missing or broken beyond repair. I would have to make them by hand. I picked up a file. I needed to shape a new winding stem. I clamped a piece of raw steel into the vise. The sound of metal rasping against metal filled the room. Scritch, scritch, scritch. As I worked, a memory surfaced. I was 10 years old. I was sitting in my father's study at the mansion. He was working on a perpetual calendar mechanism. I was just watching, fascinated by his hands. They were steady as rock. Elias, he had said, not looking up. Do you know why we use jewels in a watch movement? Because they're pretty? I had asked. He stopped working and looked at me. He took off his loupe. His eyes were grey like mine. No, because they are hard. Rubies and sapphires reduce friction. They take the punishment so the metal doesn't wear down. The most beautiful things in a machine are there to bear the burden. He had handed me the movement. People are like that too. The ones who shine the brightest are often the ones grinding themselves down to keep everything moving. I shook the memory away. At the time, I thought he was talking about himself. Now, alone in the woods, filing a piece of steel, I wondered if he had been talking about me. Or maybe he was warning me. You will have to be hard, Elias. You will have to bear the friction. I worked until my fingers bled. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop to rest. I was possessed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fixing a watch for a customer. I wasn't fixing it to pay rent. I was fixing it to understand. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Reluctantly, I wiped my hands and picked it up. It was a notification from a business news app. Headline: The New Era of Thorne. Julian Thorne announces record-breaking pre-orders for the Legacy 2.0. Stock prices soar. Below the headline was a picture of Julian and Isabella clinking glasses at a press conference. They looked golden, untouchable. I looked at the picture, and then I looked at my bleeding thumb. I looked at the rusted stove and the dark corners of the cabin. A surge of bitterness rose in my throat, acidic and hot. They were winning. They were erasing everything my father stood for, turning his art into a commodity, and the world was cheering for them. I threw the phone onto the cot. I turned back to the vise. I filed harder. The sound became aggressive. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I wasn't just fixing a watch anymore. I was sharpening a weapon. I didn't know what the watch did. I didn't know why it was so complex. But I knew one thing. My father had hidden it from them. He had hidden it from the world. And he had given it to me. There was a reason. I paused. The file hovered over the steel. My eyes drifted to the back of the workbench where the shadows were deepest. In my cleaning frenzy earlier, I had stacked some old crates there. One of them had a label that was barely legible. I squinted. Project Kronos, 1984. The year I was born. I put down the file. I walked over to the crate. It was nailed shut. I grabbed the crowbar I had used on the front door. With a grunt of effort, I pried the lid off. The nails screeched in protest. Inside, there were no watch parts. There were journals, dozens of them, leather-bound, mildew-spotted journals. I picked up the top one. I opened it. The pages were filled with my father's handwriting. Sketches, equations, and notes. I flipped through the pages randomly. Entry, October 14th. The escapement is unstable. The material cannot handle the torque. I need something stronger. Entry, November 2nd. Isabella is asking about the R&D budget again. I had to lie. She cannot know about the master key. If she finds out, she will sell it to the highest bidder. I froze. The master key. I read on. Entry, December 20th. I have hidden the prototypes in the molds. If I die, the company must not fall into the hands of those who do not understand the weight of time. The watch is the map. The cabin is the vault. The cabin is the vault. I looked around the room. The rotting walls, the sagging ceiling, the uneven floorboards. I had thought this place was a punishment. I had thought it was a trash heap. I dropped the journal and scrambled to the center of the room. I looked at the floorboards. I grabbed the lamp and shone it low across the wood. There near the stove, the dust settled differently. The seams of the floorboards were too straight, too clean. I grabbed the crowbar again. My heart was hammering against my ribs, drowning out the sound of the wind outside. I jammed the metal tip into the gap between the boards. I pushed. Creak. The board lifted. It wasn't nailed down. It was a hatch. I pulled the board away. Below it was darkness. A cool, stale draft drifted up, smelling of dry paper and oil. I shone the light down. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a staircase. My father hadn't just left me a cabin. He had left me a headquarters. I sat back on my heels, breathless. The anger that had fueled me all day evaporated, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Julian was playing CEO in a skyscraper. Isabella was counting money in a mansion. They thought the game was over. They thought they had won. But down here, in the dirt and the dark, the real game was just beginning. I looked at the watch on the bench. It wasn't just a machine. It was the key to the door I had just found. I picked up the phone. I looked at the photo of Julian one last time. "Enjoy the champagne, brother," I whispered to the screen. "Because your time is running out." I stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and took the first step down into the darkness. The staircase was narrow, spiraling down into the cool earth. The air changed as I descended. It lost the smell of damp rot and wet leaves, replaced by the scent of conditioned air, graphite, and old paper. It was the smell of a library or a museum. At the bottom I found a heavy steel door. It had no handle, only a keypad and a strange circular indentation. I looked at the indentation. Then I looked at the pocket watch in my hand. The size was a perfect match. My heart hammered against my ribs. I carefully pressed the watch into the slot. It fit with a satisfying thud. I turned it clockwise. The heavy tumblers inside the door groaned, shifting for the first time in decades. With a pneumatic hiss, the steel doors swung open. I stepped inside and waved my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a space that made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a basement. It was a sanctuary. The room was vast, stretching far beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling metal shelves, and on those shelves sat the true fortune of the Thorne family. Not gold bars, not stacks of cash, but molds. Hundreds of heavy brass and steel molds. These were the original casts for every watch case, every bridge, every tiny gear my father had ever designed. I walked down the aisle, running my hand along the cold metal. I saw the mold for the 1998 Equinox, the watch that put our company on the map. I saw the prototypes for the Celestial series. These were the DNA of the company. Without these, you could only make copies. You could never make originals. At the far end of the room was a drafting table, pristine and waiting. On it lay a single thick document bound in red leather. The cover read, "The Thorne Constitution." I opened it. It wasn't a corporate bylaw. It was a technical manifesto. My father had codified the exact chemical composition of the alloys, the precise tolerances for every screw, the specific angle of every bevel. And on the last page, there was a legal clause, signed and notarized by a name I didn't recognize, Judge Harrison, a man who had retired 20 years ago. The clause was simple. Possession of the original molds constitutes the ultimate authority on quality assurance. Any product bearing the Thorne name must match the specifications of these molds. The keeper of the molds holds the right to veto any production line that deviates by more than 0.01%. I leaned back against the table, the heavy book in my hands. I started to laugh. It was a quiet, shaking laugh that echoed in the underground vault. Julian thought he was the CEO because he had the title. Isabella thought she owned the company because she had the shares. But they were just renting the name. My father had left the soul of the company here, underground, with the sun he had cast aside. He had given me the veto. I wasn't just a disinherited mechanic. I was the Quality Control Department, and I was about to fail them. I spent the next 3 days underground. I slept on the floor. I ate cold beans from the can. I was absorbing decades of my father's genius. I studied the blueprints. I memorized the specs. I began to understand the tragedy of Arthur Thorne. He hadn't hated me. He was afraid for me. He knew that if I grew up in the light of his wealth, I would become like Julian, soft, entitled, and blind to the details. He had pushed me away to make me hungry. He had given me silence so I would learn to listen to the machines. It was a cruel form of love, a twisted pedagogy. But as I looked at the intricate diagrams, I realized it had worked. I was the only one who could understand this room. On the 4th morning, the silence of the woods was broken. I was upstairs in the cabin, boiling water for coffee, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. It wasn't my car. It was heavy, an SUV. I walked to the window and peered through a crack in the boards. A sleek black Range Rover was parked next to my battered sedan. 2 men in suits stepped out. One was tall and broad, like a bodyguard. The other was slim, holding a briefcase, stepping gingerly over the mud in his expensive loafers. I recognized the slim one, Peter Salinger, the fixer for Thorne Sons. He was the man they sent when they wanted a problem to disappear quietly. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp. I held my coffee mug, trying to look more relaxed than I felt. "Mr. Thorne," Salinger said, putting on a fake, bright smile. "Good morning. Quite the rustic retreat you have here." "Salinger," I nodded. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did Julian run out of people to fire?" Salinger chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Always the wit, Elias." "No, Julian is doing quite well. The company is thriving. We're actually here to do you a favor." "A favor," I repeated. "I'm listening." Salinger gestured to the woods around us. This land, it's beautiful, in a wild sort of way. But let's be honest, Elias, it's a dump. The cabin is condemned. The location is inconvenient. You're living like a fugitive. I like the quiet, I said. We want to buy it, Salinger said, cutting to the chase. Thorne Sons is looking to develop a luxury eco-resort. The Thorne Wilderness Experience. We think this location is perfect. We're prepared to offer you $500,000. Cash. Today. 500,000. It was enough to fix my life. I could move back to the city. I could open my own shop. I could forget about the insults and the rejection. But then I thought about the basement. I thought about the steel door. If I sold the land, they would bulldoze the cabin. They would dig up the foundation. They would find the vault. Julian would get the molds. He would destroy the evidence of the veto. Or worse, he would lock it away forever and continue pumping out garbage watches. Not for sale, I said. Salinger's smile faltered. Elias, be reasonable. The assessment of this land is barely 50 grand. We are offering you 10 times its value. It's charity. I don't need charity, I said, taking a sip of coffee. And I don't want a resort here. This is my home. Salinger sighed and exchanged a look with the bodyguard. He took a step closer to the porch. The playfulness was gone from his voice. Look, Elias, we didn't want to make this ugly, but Julian is determined. If you don't sell, we'll find other ways. The county has strict codes about habitable structures. This shack violates about 40 of them. We can have it condemned. We can have you evicted. We can make your life a legal hell. Is that a threat? I asked. It's a forecast, Salinger said cold. Take the money. Go back to your little apartment. Fix your little clocks. Leave the business to the big boys. Rage, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. Little clocks. They still didn't get it. They thought power came from size. They didn't know that the most powerful force in a watch is the hairspring, thinner than a human hair. Get off my property, I said. Salinger stared at me for a long moment. He saw something in my eyes that made him pause. He buttoned his jacket. You have 24 hours to reconsider, Elias. After that, the bulldozers don't ask for permission. He turned and walked back to the car. The bodyguard gave me one last intimidating glare before following. The Range Rover reversed and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on my face. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. They were coming. They were going to destroy the cabin. I ran back inside. I went straight to the hatch. I couldn't move the molds. There were tons of metal down there. I couldn't hide the vault. I needed leverage. I needed to activate the veto. But to do that, I needed proof. I needed to show that their current products were inferior. And I needed the watch. I looked at the workbench. The pocket watch, the key, was still in pieces. I had used the case to open the door, but the movement was still a wreck. The mechanism inside wasn't just a lock. I suspected it was also a timer, a countdown. I remembered a note in one of the journals I read last night. The veto is only valid if the Master Chronometer is functional. It must keep perfect time to certify the standard. If I walked into a boardroom with a broken watch, they would laugh me out. If I walked in with a functioning Master Chronometer and the Constitution, I could bring the empire to its knees. I had 24 hours before they started the legal war. I had to fix the most complicated watch in history, alone, in the woods, with a demolition crew on the horizon. I sat down at the bench. I turned the lights up to maximum brightness. I took a deep breath. "Okay, Dad," I whispered. "You wanted to see if I could handle the pressure? Let's find out." I picked up the tweezers. I picked up the mainspring barrel. The war had begun. Time is usually an abstract concept. It is numbers on a screen, shadows on a sundial, all the graying of hair. But in that cabin, time became a physical weight. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on my shoulders. I had 24 hours, 1,440 minutes, 86,400 seconds. And every single one of those seconds was slipping through my fingers like sand. I didn't sleep. Sleep was a luxury for people who had a future. I stayed at the workbench, my world reduced to a circle of light 5 inches in diameter. The Master Chronometer lay dismantled before me. It was terrifyingly beautiful. My father hadn't just built a watch, he had built a universe. There were over 800 parts. Some were so small that if I sneezed, they would vanish forever. The problem was the escapement. This is the heart of any watch, the mechanism that slices time into equal beats. In a normal watch, it ticks 5 or 6 times a second. In this watch, the escapement was a detent design, something usually found in marine chronometers from the 18th century, used for navigating oceans. It was incredibly precise, but notoriously fragile. And this one was shattered. I held a microscopic ruby palette in my tweezers. My hands had to be steadier than a surgeon's. One tremor, one slip, and the ruby would crack, rendering the veto useless. Beep, beep, beep. The sound of a heavy truck backing up shattered my concentration. I jumped, dropping the tweezers. The ruby fell onto the velvet mat. Safe. I exhaled, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I went to the window. Outside, a county sheriff's cruiser was parked next to a white pickup truck. A man in a uniform was stepping out, adjusting his belt. Next to him was a man in a hard hat holding a clipboard. They were early. I grabbed the shotgun my father kept above the door. It wasn't loaded, I didn't even have shells, but it was a symbol. I walked out onto the porch. "Stay right there," I called out. The sheriff looked up, squinting against the sun. He was an older man, his face weathered like old leather. He didn't look scared of the gun. He looked tired. "Elias Thorne?" the sheriff asked. "I'm Sheriff Miller. Put the weapon down, son. We're not here to fight." "You're on private property," I said, keeping the barrel pointed at the ground. "We're here to serve a notice," the man with the clipboard said, stepping forward. He had the smug look of a bureaucrat who enjoyed his small amount of power. "This structure has been deemed unsafe for habitation under County Code 74B. Structural instability, fire hazards, lack of sanitation." "It's been standing for 40 years, I argued. "It's fine." "The report says otherwise," the inspector said, waving a piece of paper. "A complaint was filed yesterday by the owner of the adjacent land." "Julian," I muttered. He didn't own the adjacent land, but he probably bought it this morning just to file this complaint. "You have to vacate immediately," the inspector said. "We are here to condemn the building. The power will be cut and the perimeter will be fenced off for demolition." "I have 24 hours, I said, my voice rising. "Salinger said I had 24 hours. "Salinger is in the law," the sheriff said gently. "The law says if a building is dangerous, you get out now. I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne, but you can't stay here tonight." I looked at the sheriff. I saw the apology in his eyes, but I also saw the resolve. Julian had pulled strings that reached all the way out here. If I refused, they would arrest me. If I was arrested, I couldn't fix the watch. If I didn't fix the watch, I lost everything. I lowered the gun. I need time to pack, I said. My equipment is delicate. The sheriff nodded. I can give you an hour, but then I have to padlock the door. An hour. It was a death sentence. It would take me days to fix the escapement. I couldn't move the workshop. I certainly couldn't move the vault downstairs. If they padlocked the door, I would be locked out of the only leverage I had. Okay, I said, forcing my face to remain neutral. Give me an hour. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't pack. I didn't even look for a suitcase. I went straight to the floorboards. I pried open the hatch to the basement. I carried the workbench down. It was heavy, awkward, and I scraped my knuckles raw against the narrow walls of the staircase. I carried the lamps. I carried the generator fuel. I carried the food. I was moving underground. If they were going to seal the cabin, fine. Let them seal it. I would be beneath them, in the belly of the earth, working while they put up their fences. It was a desperate plan. The air down there was limited. There was no bathroom. If they bulldozed the house while I was downstairs, I would be buried alive. But I didn't care. I was possessed by the ghost of my father's ambition. I finished moving the last box of tools just as the sheriff knocked on the door. Mr. Thorne, Miller called out. Time's up. I stood in the center of the empty cabin room. I had replaced the floorboards over the hatch. I had dusted dirt over the seams so it looked undisturbed. I grabbed a single duffel bag filled with old clothes, a decoy. I opened the front door. I'm ready, I said. The sheriff looked at the bag. Is that it? What about the tools? I'll come back for them with a truck when I find a place to stay, I lied. They're too heavy to move now. The inspector peered inside. The room was empty. He nodded, satisfied. He slapped a bright orange sticker on the door. Condemned. Do not enter. Do you need a ride to town? The sheriff asked. No, I said. My car works. I walked to my car, threw the bag in the back, and started the engine. I drove down the driveway, watching in the rearview mirror as the sheriff padlocked the front door. I drove until I was out of sight, around the bend of the mountain road. Then I pulled over. I waited. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. The sheriff's cruiser and the inspector's truck drove past me, heading back to civilization. They thought I was gone. They thought they had won. I reversed the car. I drove it deep into the woods, hiding it under a canopy of pine branches about a half-mile from the cabin. I covered it with a tarp. Then I walked back. I approached the cabin from the rear, moving silently through the brush like a thief on my own property. The orange sticker on the front door mocked me. The windows were sealed. It was a tomb. I went to the back of the house, where the stone foundation met the earth. There was an old coal chute there, rusted shut. I had found it on the blueprints in the basement. It led directly into the vault. I wedged my crowbar into the seam of the chute. I pushed with everything I had. The metal groaned, a high-pitched screech that sounded like a scream in the quiet woods. I froze, waiting for someone to shout. Silence. I pushed again. The chute popped open. A blast of cool, stale air hit my face. I squeezed my body through the narrow opening, sliding down a metal slide into the darkness. I landed on the concrete floor of the vault with a thud. I was in. I was alone. And I was trapped. I stood up and brushed the dust off my clothes. I turned on the battery-powered lantern. The vault was exactly as I left it. The rows of molds stood like silent soldiers. The workbench was set up in the corner. "Welcome home, Elias," I whispered. I sat down at the bench. I had no internet, no cell signal, no sunlight. Just me, the watch, and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation somewhere in the pipes. I picked up the ruby palette again. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline. I had to calm down. I closed my eyes and imagined my father's hands. Steady, certain. "The friction is the enemy, Elias." His voice echoed in my head. "Patience is the lubricant." I worked. Hours bled into each other. I lost track of whether it was day or night. I successfully reset the palette stones. I balanced the wheel. I polished the pivots until they shone like diamonds. But as I began to reassemble the gear train, I hit a wall. The mainspring. The power source of the watch. It was a fusee chain drive, a tiny bicycle chain that wrapped around a cone to ensure constant torque. The chain was broken. A link was snapped. The chain was microscopic. Each link was the size of a grain of sand. To fix it, I needed to forge a new rivet that was 0.05 millimeters thick. I searched the supply boxes. Nothing. My father hadn't left spare chain links. I slammed my fist on the table. "Damn it!" The sound echoed aggressively in the concrete box. Why? Why leave me the puzzle but not the pieces? I stood up and paced the room. I was hungry, but I ignored it. I was thirsty, but I rationed my water. I walked up and down the aisles of molds. I ran my hands over the cold steel forms. The 1984 Chrono. The 1990 Navigator. The 2005 Tourbillon. Wait. I stopped at a mold labeled 1955 Prototype, the chain drive. My father hadn't left spare parts because he had left the molds. He expected me to make the parts. I looked at the corner of the vault. There was a small, strange machine covered in a canvas sheet. I had ignored it earlier, thinking it was an air compressor. I pulled the sheet off. It was a micro lathe, a jewel of a machine, Swiss-made, designed for extreme precision. And next to it, a small crucible for melting metal. I smiled. It was a grim, tired smile, but it was real. "You old bastard," I said affectionately. "You didn't want a repairman. You wanted a creator." I fired up the crucible using the butane torch I had brought. I took a piece of scrap gold from a failed case design. I melted it down. I poured it into a tiny ingot. Then I moved to the lathe. The noise of the lathe was loud in the enclosed space, a high-pitched whine. I prayed the sound didn't travel up the coal chute. I prayed no one was walking in the woods above. I spent 6 hours machining a single rivet. My eyes burned. My back screamed in agony. But when I turned off the lathe, I held a speck of gold on the tip of my finger. It was perfect. I returned to the bench. I threaded the tiny chain together. I inserted the rivet. I hammered it flat with a hammer the size of a pencil. The chain held. I reassembled the drivetrain. I wound the fusee. The tension built up. I felt the stored energy in the spring, like a living thing waking up from a coma. I placed the balance wheel assembly back in. This was it, the moment of resurrection. I nudged the wheel. Tick, tock, tick. It was alive. The sound was strong, a robust, metallic heartbeat. It wasn't just ticking, it was singing. I slumped back in my chair, tears of exhaustion pricking my eyes. It was working. The master chronometer was running. But then, something happened. As the hand swept past the 12 o'clock marker, the watch made a strange whirring sound. A secondary dial, one I hadn't noticed before because it was hidden beneath the face, clicked into place. It wasn't measuring seconds. It was measuring years. The dial spun rapidly, calibrating itself. It stopped at the number 1984, then 1991, then 2001. It was cycling through dates. I leaned in closer. What was this? Suddenly my phone, which I thought had no signal, buzzed. I jumped. I looked at the screen. 1 bar of signal. Just a ghost of a connection leaking down the coal chute. Incoming call. Julian. I stared at the name. Why was he calling me? He thought I was gone. I shouldn't answer. It would give away that I was still close, but my thumb hovered over the button. I needed to know what he was thinking. I needed to know his next move. I answered, but I didn't speak. I just breathed into the phone. Elias? Julian's voice was smooth, but there was a crack in the veneer, a hint of liquor. I know you're there, or I know you're listening. I remained silent. They told me the house is condemned, Julian said. I should be happy, it's what I wanted. But you know, Mother is throwing a party tonight. A victory gala. She's toasting to the future. He laughed, a bitter, sloppy sound. Do you know why I hated you, Elias? He asked. He wasn't talking to me anymore. He was talking to the void. Because when we were kids, Dad let you into the workshop. He locked the door and it was just you and him. I used to sit in the hallway and listen. I heard you laughing. I heard him teaching you. I gripped the phone tighter. I remembered those days. I didn't know Julian was outside. He never taught me anything, Julian whispered. He just gave me his credit card and told me to go play. He bought my love, but he earned yours. That's why I took the company, Elias. If I can't have his respect, I'll take his name. I'll burn it into the ground if I have to, but it will be mine. It will never be yours, I said. My voice was raspy, dry from the dust. There was a silence on the other end. Julian sobered up instantly. So you are still around, he said, his voice turning cold again. You're a cockroach, Elias. Hard to kill. I'm not a cockroach, I said. I'm the watchmaker. Enjoy the woods, Julian spat. The bulldozers are coming tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I'm coming to watch. I want to see that cabin turn into splinters. He hung up. I looked at the watch on the table. It was ticking steadily. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. I had the watch running. But I had one problem left. I needed to get out of the vault, get past the bulldozers, and get to the city to use the veto. And I had to do it without being seen. Suddenly, the lights in the vault flickered. The generator upstairs, the one I had left running as a decoy, must have run out of fuel. Or someone had turned it off. I switched to the battery lantern. The shadows lengthened. Then I heard it. Thump. A footstep. Above me, on the floor of the cabin. Someone was inside the condemned house. Thump. Thump. They were walking slowly, deliberately. They stopped right above the hatch. I held my breath. Had I cleared the dust properly? Did the seams look natural? A muffled voice drifted down through the floorboards. He's not here. Place is empty. It was Salinger. Check the floor, another voice said, a deeper voice. The old man was paranoid. He liked hidden spaces. My blood ran cold. They knew. or they suspected. I heard the sound of furniture being dragged, the heavy scrape of wood on wood. They were moving the table I had placed over the hatch. I looked around the vault. There was no other exit. The coal chute was too steep to climb up quickly. If they opened the hatch, I was trapped like a rat in a cage. I grabbed the heavy iron Constitution book. I grabbed the Master Chronometer. The sound of a crowbar hitting the floorboards echoed above. Crunch. They were prying it open. I backed into the shadows, clutching the watch to my chest. I had the key. I had the law. But now, I had to fight. The wood groaned. It was a sound like a bone snapping. Above me, the hatch boards began to lift, prying away from the joists. Dust and debris rained down into the vault, coating the workbench in a fine grey powder. I scrambled backward, extinguishing the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room, save for the thin, jagged blade of light cutting through the opening above. I clutched the Constitution under one arm and the Master Chronometer in my pocket. My other hand gripped a canister of pressurized cleaning solvent and the butane torch I had used for the gold. I wasn't a soldier. I was a man who worked with gears and levers. I understood one thing: action and reaction. Flashlight, Salinger's voice commanded from above. A beam of light stabbed into the gloom, sweeping across the concrete floor. It missed me by inches. I was pressed flat against the side of the metal staircase, in the blind spot. "It's deep," the bodyguard grunted. "I see shelves. Looks like a warehouse." "Go down," Salinger ordered. "If he's down there, drag him up. If he's not, see what he's hiding." Heavy boots hit the first step. The metal staircase vibrated against my back. Clang, clang. The bodyguard was big, descending slowly, his gun drawn. He was blocking the only exit. I waited. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady. I needed him to be lower, closer. When his boots were at eye level with me crouching under the stairs, I acted. I flicked the lighter on the torch. The blue flame hissed to life. In the same motion, I sprayed the solvent directly through the flame, aiming at the space behind the bodyguard, towards the center of the room. Whoosh! A fireball, bright and sudden as a miniature sun, erupted in the confined space. It wasn't lethal, but the sudden flash in the pitch-black room was blinding. The acoustic boom was deafening. "What the hell?" the bodyguard screamed, stumbling forward, his hands flying to his eyes. He missed a step. Gravity took over. He tumbled past me, crashing onto the concrete floor in a heap of limbs and curses. I didn't wait to see if he was conscious. I launched myself up the stairs. My boots rang on the metal. I took the steps 2 at a time, adrenaline fueling my muscles. I burst up through the hatch hole. Salinger was standing there, shielding his eyes from the smoke billowing up. He wasn't expecting me. He was expecting his muscle to return. "Elias?" he gasped, reaching into his jacket. I didn't stop. I used my momentum. I lowered my shoulder and rammed into him. It wasn't a graceful fight move. It was desperation. Salinger was slim, an office creature. I was tired, but I had spent the last 3 days hauling steel. He flew backward, crashing into the rotting wall of the cabin. The dry wood splintered. He slumped to the floor, winded. I ran. I bolted out the front door, leaping over the porch railing. The fresh air hit my lungs like ice. I hit the ground running, my shoes slipping on the wet leaves. "Stop him!" Salinger screamed from the doorway behind me. A gunshot cracked the air. Pop! And a chunk of bark exploded from a pine tree to my right. They were shooting. This wasn't just a legal eviction anymore. This was a cleanup operation. I didn't look back. I dove into the dense underbrush, tearing my shirt on thorns, scrambling up the ridge. I knew these woods. I had played here as a boy while my father sat in the cabin. I knew the deer trails. I knew where the ravine was. I could hear the bodyguard crashing through the door behind me, shouting. He was faster than me, but he was heavy. I could hear him slipping on the mud. I reached the spot where I had hidden the car. I ripped the tarp off. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys. "Come on, come on," I hissed, scrabbling in the dirt. I found them. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered. The cold dampness had gotten to it. "Come on, old girl." I turned it again. The engine roared to life. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, slinging dirt everywhere. The car lurched backward onto the logging road just as the bodyguard burst through the trees, gun raised. He fired again. The rear windshield shattered, raining safety glass onto the back seat. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. The sedan fishtailed, then found traction. I sped down the winding dirt road, the suspension groaning as I hit potholes deep enough to swallow a wheel. I checked the rearview mirror. No one was following yet. Their SUV was back at the cabin. I had a 2-minute head start. I drove like a madman. I didn't take the main road to town. I took the old service fire road that cut through the valley. It was dangerous, narrow, and barely paved. But it would spit me out on the highway 10 miles south, bypassing the town sheriff. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain set in. My shoulder throbbed where I had hit Salinger. My lungs burned, but I was alive. I reached into my pocket. The Master Chronometer was still there. I pulled it out. The glass was intact. It was still ticking. Tick, tick, tick. It was calm. It didn't care about the gunshots or the car chase. It just measured the moment. I reached the highway. I merged into traffic, blending in with the trucks and commuters. I was just another dirty car on a busy road. I let out a long, shaky breath. I was safe. For now. But where could I go? I couldn't go back to my apartment. They would be waiting. I couldn't go to the police. Julian owned the narrative, and I was technically a squatter who had just assaulted a corporate employee. I needed an ally, someone who knew the company, knew the stakes, and had a reason to hate Julian. I thought of Marcus Vance. The engineer I had seen leaving Julian's office days ago, looking defeated. Marcus had been my father's right hand. He was a purist. If anyone would respect the veto, it was him. I drove to a gas station, parked in the blind spot of the cameras, and used a burner phone I had bought days ago. I dialed the number of the engineering department, hoping Marcus hadn't been fired yet. "Engineering, this is Susan." "I need to speak to Marcus Vance," I said, disguising my voice. "Tell him it's about the fusee chain." "One moment." A click. Then a tired voice. "Vance speaking. Who is this?" "It's Elias," I said softly. Silence. Then a hushed whisper. "Elias, my God, everyone says you've gone crazy. Julian says you attacked a surveyor." "Julian lies," I said. "Marcus, listen to me. I have the Master Chronometer." "That's a myth," Marcus said immediately. "Your father talked about it, but no one ever saw it." "It's not a myth. I'm holding it, and it's running. It has a detent escapement and a chain drive, and I have the Constitution." I could hear Marcus breathing on the other end. The technical details had hooked him. He knew I couldn't make that up. "Where are you?" he asked. I'm coming to the city. I need a place to hide. Somewhere with tools. Somewhere Julian doesn't know about. Meet me at the old district, Marcus said. There's a clock tower on 4th and Main. The city abandoned it years ago, but I still have the keys to the maintenance room. I go there to think. 4th and Main, midnight, I said. Elias, Marcus added, his voice tense. Be careful. Julian is launching the Legacy 2.0 tomorrow at the gala. He's desperate. If he finds you... I'm counting on it, I said, and hung up. The city at night was a different beast than the woods. It was a canyon of neon and concrete. I ditched my car in a long-term parking lot at the airport to throw off any trackers, then took 3 different buses to get to the old district. The clock tower loomed above the street, a relic of a time when people actually looked up to check the time. Now it was dark, its hands frozen at 6:15. I found the side door. It was unlocked. I slipped inside. The maintenance room was high up, just behind the giant clock face. The air smelled of pigeons and grease. A single lantern was lit. Marcus was sitting on a crate holding a thermos. He looked older than I remembered. When I walked in, he stood up. He looked at my torn clothes, the glass in my hair, the dirt on my face. You look like hell, kid, he said. I've had a bad week, I replied. I walked over to a workbench covered in a dusty sheet. I pulled out the pocket watch and the leather-bound book. I placed them gently on the table. Marcus approached them like they were holy relics. He put on his glasses. He picked up the watch. He listened to the beat. He opened the back. I showed him the trick with the thumbnail. He gasped when he saw the movement. My God, he whispered. He actually did it. He built a singularity. He opened the book. He read the legal clause. He read the technical specs. His hands began to shake. This gives you absolute power, Marcus said, looking at me with wide eyes. You can shut down the factory. You can recall every unit. You can bankrupt the company. I don't want to bankrupt it, I said. I want to save it. The Legacy 2.0 is garbage, Marcus. You know it, I know it. Marcus nodded grimly. It's worse than garbage. It's a fraud. The balance springs are made of a cheap alloy. They lose elasticity in 6 months. The watches will stop. Then we stop Julian tomorrow, I said. How? Marcus asked. The gala is high security, invitation only. And Julian has probably put your face on a watch list. I don't need an invitation, I said, looking at the giant gears of the tower clock behind us. I need an entrance. And I need a suit. Marcus looked at me. Then a slow grin spread across his face. I still have my tuxedo from the annual board dinner. It might be a bit big on you, but with some pins. And the entrance? The gala is at the Thorne headquarters, right? The grand atrium? Yes. The atrium has a pneumatic tube system for the old document transfer, Marcus said. It's not used anymore, but the ducts run right behind the stage. It's tight, claustrophobic. I've spent the last 3 days in a hole in the ground, I said. I like tight spaces. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a key card. This will get you into the service tunnels. But Elias, once you're on that stage, you're on your own. I can't protect you from the lawyers. I have the best lawyer in the world, I said, tapping the Constitution book. His name is Arthur Thorne. The next 18 hours were a blur of preparation. I shaved in the clock tower sink with cold water. Marcus pinned the tuxedo to fit my leaner frame. We polished my shoes with machine grease until they shone. We studied the blueprints of the headquarters. We timed the speech. Julian was scheduled to unveil the watch at 8 p.m. At 7 p.m., I was crawling through a ventilation shaft 3 stories above the marble floor of the Thorne headquarters. The shaft was narrow, lined with dust. I had to drag the heavy book and the watch wrapped in velvet. Below me, I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the string quartet playing Mozart. I reached the grate that overlooked the stage. I peered down. The atrium was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers, 1,000 guests in designer gowns and tuxedos. In the center of the stage, a giant screen displayed the Thorne logo. A pedestal stood ready, covered by a silk cloth. Julian was there. He looked victorious. He was shaking hands with the mayor. Isabella was beside him, draped in diamonds that probably cost more than the factory workers made in a year. They looked perfect, and they were selling a lie. I checked the Master Chronometer, 7:55 p.m., 5 minutes until showtime. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Marcus, who was in the crowd. He hadn't been fired yet, so he was still invited. Text: Security is heavy at the wings. You have to drop directly onto the gantry. Timing is everything. I took a deep breath. I unscrewed the bolts of the grate. I was directly above the lighting rig. At 8 p.m., the lights dimmed. A spotlight hid the stage. The crowd went silent. Julian stepped up to the microphone. He looked handsome, charismatic, the very image of a modern CEO. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming. "Tonight we don't just tell time, we make history. My father, Arthur Thorne, built this company on tradition. But tradition can be a cage." He paused for effect. The crowd leaned in. "I am here to break that cage," Julian continued. "I present to you the Legacy 2.0, the first watch that combines classic elegance with modern efficiency." He reached for the silk cloth covering the pedestal. I pushed the grate open. I slipped through, landing silently on the catwalk 10 feet above the stage. I was in the shadows, unseen. "A watch that will last forever," Julian shouted, pulling the cloth away. A glass case was revealed. Inside sat the Legacy 2.0. It was shiny. It was gold. And I knew from 50 feet away that it was soulless. I found the ladder leading down to the backstage curtain. I slid down. I walked past a confused stagehand who tried to grab my arm. "You can't be back here," he hissed. "I'm part of the show," I said, pushing past him. I walked out from the curtain. Julian was holding the microphone, basking in the applause. He turned to look at the screen behind him. I stepped into the spotlight. The applause faltered. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Who was this man in the ill-fitting tuxedo holding a leather book? Julian turned back. His smile froze. His eyes went wide. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Elias?" he whispered, the microphone picking it up. The crowd gasped. The brother, the outcast. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice projecting clearly without a mic. I walked to the center of the stage. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to check the time." "Security!" Julian screamed, his composure shattering instantly. "Get him off the stage! He's crazy!" 2 large guards started running from the sides. I didn't flinch. I slammed the Constitution down on the podium next to Julian's watch. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "By the authority of the Founders' Constitution," I shouted, "I invoke the Master Key Veto." I pulled the pocket watch from my pocket. I held it up. The gold caught the spotlight. It was ancient, complex, and mesmerizing. "This is the standard," I announced. "And that," I pointed at Julian's watch, "is a fake." The guards were 10 feet away. "Stop!" A voice boomed from the front row. It wasn't Isabella. It wasn't the mayor. It was Judge Harrison, the man who had signed the Constitution 30 years ago. He was old, in a wheelchair, but he was there. He had recognized the book. The guards hesitated. Julian looked at the judge, then at me. His face turned purple. "He's lying. That book is a forgery. That watch is junk." "Let's find out," I said calmly. I opened the book to the last page. I opened the Master Chronometer. "If your watch is real, Julian," I said, "it will sync with this. If it's not, the company belongs to the Quality Control." The room was deadly silent. The fate of the empire hung on a single tick. The silence in the grand atrium was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs of every person in the room. 1,000 wealthy guests, who seconds ago had been politely applauding, were now frozen, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. All eyes were locked on the stage. To my left, Julian stood trembling. His face, usually a mask of practiced charm, was cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead, glistening under the harsh stage lights. To my right, the two security guards hovered uncertainly, their muscles tensed but their feet planted. They were looking past me, into the darkness of the front row, where Judge Harrison sat in his wheelchair like an ancient king on a throne. "Judge Harrison?" Julian stammered, his voice losing its booming resonance. "This man is an intruder. He is mentally unstable. He has stolen company property. Please, tell the security to remove him." The old judge slowly raised a hand. His hand was shaking with age, but his eyes, magnified by thick glasses, were sharp as steel. He reached for a microphone that a nervous waiter held out to him. "I may be retired, Julian." The judge's voice rasped through the speakers, dry and authoritative. "But I am not senile. I drafted the Thorne Constitution 30 years ago. I witnessed your father sign it. I notarized the clause regarding the keeper of the molds." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The investors exchanged nervous glances. The mention of a constitution was not in the brochure. "The book," the judge commanded, pointing a bony finger at the podium. "Open it to Article 9, Section 4. I placed my hand on the leather cover of the book. It felt warm under the lights. I looked at Julian. "Do you want to read it, brother? Or shall I?" Julian snatched the book from the podium. He flipped the pages frantically, tearing one in his haste. He found the page. His eyes scanned the text. His face went pale, draining of all color until he looked like a wax figure. This is archaic," Julian whispered, but the microphone caught every syllable. "It's a symbolic gesture. It has no legal standing." "Read it," the judge barked. Julian swallowed hard. He looked at Isabella, who was standing a few feet away. She gave him a microscopic nod, a command to manage the damage. "It says," Julian began, his voice tight, "the integrity of the Thorne brand is bound to the Master Chronometer. Should the production quality fall below the standard of the master, the bearer of the watch holds the power of veto over all manufacturing and sales. This veto is absolute and irrevocable." The crowd gasped. "A veto? Absolute power?" "Ridiculous!" Julian shouted, slamming the book shut. He regained some of his arrogance. "This is a fairy tale. There is no master chronometer. It was a myth Dad made up to scare the engineers. And even if there was one, this," he gestured dismissively at the heavy silver watch in my hand, "this piece of junk you dug out of a grave is not it." I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for. "It's not junk, Julian," I said calmly. "It's the truth. And the truth has a sound." I turned to the audio technician in the wings. I tapped the microphone on the podium. Cut the music. Max the gain on this mic. The technician, wide-eyed, obeyed. The string quartet stopped. The hum of the speakers increased. I took the Legacy 2.0, the gold, shiny watch Julian had just unveiled, out of its glass case. Julian lunged to stop me, but I was faster. I held it up to the microphone. Tick, 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 tick. The sound amplified through the hall. It was fast. It was frantic. But to a trained ear, it was messy. It sounded like a plastic toy. There was a hollow echo. The beat was irregular. It was the sound of mass production, of corners cut, of friction eating away at cheap metal. Hear that? I asked the crowd. That is the sound of a stamped alloy balance wheel. Cost of production, $4. Lifespan, 3 years. It is a disposable heart. I set the Legacy 2.0 down. Now, I said softly, listen to a real Thorne. I held the Master Chronometer to the microphone. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was completely different. It was deep, resonant. It sounded like a slow, steady drumbeat. It didn't just mark time, it commanded it. The acoustic clarity was so pure that you could almost hear the individual teeth of the gears engaging. It was the sound of a living thing. The crowd was mesmerized. The difference was undeniable. One was noise, the other was music. This watch, I said, my voice echoing in the silence, was built by hand. Every screw, every spring, every bridge. It contains a detent escapement and a fusee chain drive. It is accurate to within 0.1 seconds a day. It is the standard my father set. And it is the standard you abandoned. Julian was panting now. He looked around the room, seeing the expressions of the investors. Disappointment, suspicion, anger. So what? Julian snarled. So you have a fancy antique. That doesn't prove anything. It doesn't give you the right to stop my launch. Security! Arrest him! The guards took a step forward. Wait, I shouted. I haven't shown you the seal. I looked at the projection screen behind me. Camera, I ordered. Zoom in on the watch. The camera operator zoomed in. The giant screen showed the face of the Master Chronometer in high definition. It was scratched, tarnished, and beautiful. The Constitution says the bearer of the watch has the veto, I said. But how do we prove the watch is authentic? How do we know it's not just another copy? I looked at Julian. Because Dad knew you would try to fake it. He knew you would try to copy the look without understanding the soul. So he put a secret inside. I turned the watch over. The back was open, revealing the mesmerizing movement. The balance wheel was swinging majestically. Watch the escapement, I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small specialized winding key. I inserted it into the back of the watch. The master key isn't just a metaphor, I explained. It's a mechanism. I turned the key 3 times. Click, click, click. Suddenly, the movement of the watch changed. The gears shifted. A section of the bridge plate slid back. From the depths of the mechanical heart, a small, intricate object extended outward. It was a stamp. A tiny circular seal made of solid gold, engraved with the crest of the Thorne family. A lion holding an hourglass. But the lion was weeping. It was a detail no one had ever seen. The weeping lion. A symbol of the burden of time. The royal seal, Judge Harrison whispered from the front row. I haven't seen that in 40 years. I grabbed the Constitution. I turned to the signature page, right next to Julian's name as CEO. There was a blank space labeled Quality Control Certification. I pressed the watch, the seal extended, onto the paper. I pushed down hard. Thump. I lifted the watch. There, in red ink that had been stored inside the watch mechanism itself for decades, was the perfect imprint of the weeping lion. The veto is signed, I declared. I looked at the crowd. As the keeper of the seal, and under the authority of Article 9, I hereby declare the Legacy 2.0 unfit for the Thorne name. I revoke the production rights. I dissolve the current board of directors for gross negligence. And I freeze all assets related to the manufacturing of this fraud. Pandemonium broke out. It wasn't a riot. It was a financial collapse in real time. Phones lit up instantly. Investors were shouting into their devices, ordering sell-offs. The stock ticker on the side of the room, which had been green all night, suddenly flashed red. Thorne Sons, down 15%. Thorne Sons, down 30%. Julian stared at the screen. He watched his fortune evaporate in seconds. He watched his reputation crumble. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no!" He lunged at me. It was a clumsy, desperate attack. He grabbed my lapels, his face twisted in ugly rage. "You ruined it, you jealous, petty little rat. I built this. I sold this." I didn't fight him. I didn't have to. I just stood there, holding the watch. "You didn't build anything, Julian," I said quietly, looking into his wild eyes. "You just sold the furniture." The security guards finally moved. But they didn't grab me. They grabbed Julian. "Mr. Thorne," the head of security said, pulling Julian off me. "Please calm down." "Don't touch me!" Julian screamed, thrashing against them. "I'm the CEO. I own you. Arrest him. Arrest the judge." He was losing his mind. The veneer of the golden boy was gone, replaced by a spoilt child who had been told no for the first time in his life. I looked past Julian to Isabella. She hadn't moved. She stood near the edge of the stage, her face unreadable. She looked at Julian, screaming and kicking as he was dragged away from the microphone. Then she looked at me. She looked at the weeping lion seal on the document. Slowly, deliberately, she took a sip of her champagne. She didn't rush to help her son. She didn't scream. She calculated. She set the glass down on a waiter's tray. She smoothed her dress. And then she turned and walked away. She walked toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd of panicked investors. She was cutting her losses. Julian was a sinking ship, and Isabella Thorne didn't drown. I felt a chill go down my spine. That was the coldest thing I had ever seen. The stage was now mine. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the ache in my muscles and the hunger in my belly. Judge Harrison was wheeling himself toward the stage. Marcus Vance, my ally, had appeared from the wings, a wide grin on his face, holding a tablet showing the plummeting stock price. "You did it, kid," Marcus shouted over the noise. "The board is calling emergency meetings. The shareholders are demanding answers. The Legacy 2.0 is dead in the water." "It's not about the stock," I said, carefully closing the back of the Master Chronometer. "It's about the name." I looked out at the sea of chaos I had created. The carefully curated gala was a wreck. People were arguing. Waiters were confused. The beautiful illusion of Thorne Sons had been shattered. But in the center of the noise, I held the only thing that was real. I walked down the steps of the stage. The crowd parted for me. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and awe. I wasn't the hermit anymore. I wasn't the failure. I was the man with the veto. I walked straight to Judge Harrison. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, looking up at me, "your father would have been complicatedly proud." "He was a complicated man," I replied. "What now?" the judge asked. "You've stopped the engine. The company is crashing. If you don't do something, Thorne Sons will be bankrupt by morning." "Let it crash," I said. "Let the rot burn out." "And then?" "And then," I said, looking at the watch, "we rebuild. Slowly. Properly." I walked out of the grand atrium. I walked through the heavy glass doors and out into the cool night air of the city. The sirens were already wailing in the distance. Police, maybe? Or just the sound of a city that never stops. I sat down on the curb, oblivious to the dirt on my tuxedo pants. I put the watch to my ear. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. It was the only stable thing in the world. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Salinger, the fixer. Text: "We need to talk. I can help you transition the power. Don't shut me out." I deleted the text. I threw the burner phone into a trash can. I wasn't playing their game anymore. They had to play mine. I looked up at the sky. The city lights drowned out the stars, just like the wealth had drowned out my father's vision. But I knew the stars were there, just like I knew the truth was in the gears. I closed my eyes. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to feel the grief. Not for the company, but for the time lost. For the years I spent thinking I wasn't good enough. "I fixed it, Dad," I whispered to the empty street. I fixed it. But as I sat there, a black limousine pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down. It was Isabella. She wasn't running away. She was repositioning. "Get in, Elias," she said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the panic that had consumed Julian. "I have nothing to say to you," I said, not moving. "Julian is finished," she said, stating a fact. "The board will fire him within the hour. The lawsuits will bury him. He's a casualty." "He's your son," I said, disgusted. "He's a bad investment," she corrected. "But you are interesting. You have the veto. You have the power. But you don't have the money to run a factory. You don't have the connections to buy raw materials. You have a watch, Elias. You don't have an empire." She opened the door. "Get in. Let's discuss the terms of your regency." I stared at her. She was a monster. A survivor. She would sell her own child to stay in the game. I stood up. I walked to the window. I leaned in close so she could see the dirt on my face and the fire in my eyes. "You're right, Isabella," I said. "I don't have an empire. But I have the keys to the kingdom. And I'm changing the locks." I slammed her car door shut. "Go away." She stared at me through the glass, her expression tightening for the first time. She tapped the partition and the driver pulled away. I watched the limo disappear into traffic. I was alone. I was broke. I was technically homeless. But I was free. I stood up and started walking. Not toward a hotel, not toward a bank. I walked toward the old district, back to the clock tower, back to the workbench. The war for the company was over. The war for the soul of the work was just beginning. The morning after the end of the world is always surprisingly quiet. I woke up on a pile of canvas drop cloths in the maintenance room of the clock tower. My tuxedo was balled up in the corner, stained with grease and sweat. My body ached, a deep, bruised ache that settled into my bones. For a moment, looking at the giant, dusty gears of the tower clock, I thought I had dreamt it all. The gala, the veto, the fall of Julian. Then I looked at the workbench. The Master Chronometer was there, sitting on a velvet cloth. Beside it was the Constitution. They were real. The heavy steel door creaked open. Marcus walked in, carrying 2 cardboard cups of coffee and a stack of newspapers. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week, but there was a strange energy in his eyes. He set the coffee down. "Black, 2 sugars," he said. "Just like your dad." I sat up, rubbing my face. "What's the damage, Marcus?" Marcus threw the newspapers onto the table. The headlines screamed in bold black ink. "Thorne dynasty crumbles. Stock plummets 60% overnight. CEO removed in boardroom coup." "It's a bloodbath," Marcus said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Trading was suspended at 9 a.m. The banks are calling in the loans. The factory in Shenzhen has already halted production because we can't pay the suppliers. Everyone is panicking, Elias. The workers, the investors, the janitors." I picked up a paper. I saw a photo of Julian being escorted out of the building by security, his hand over his face. He looked small. "I did this," I whispered. "You stopped a runaway train," Marcus corrected. "It's messy, but the train was heading off a cliff anyway. If you hadn't used the veto, the Legacy 2.0 would have failed in 6 months. Then the company would have been sued into oblivion. At least now, the wound is clean." "A clean wound still bleeds," I said. I stood up and walked to the small circular window. The city below was waking up. People were going to work. They didn't care about luxury watches. They cared about paying rent. "Judge Harrison called," Marcus said. "The remaining board members are meeting at the headquarters in an hour. They want to know what the keeper of the seal wants to do. They're terrified of you, Elias. You're the man who burned $1 billion in 10 minutes. I turned back to him. "I'm not a CEO, Marcus. I don't know how to run a board meeting." "They don't need a CEO right now," Marcus said, smiling grimly. "They need a coroner. Go tell them how we survive." I didn't wear a suit to the meeting. I wore a clean flannel shirt and jeans I had bought at a thrift store on the way over. I walked into the boardroom on the top floor of Thorne Tower. The room smelled of fear and stale air conditioning. 6 men and 2 women sat around the long mahogany table. They were the survivors, the directors who hadn't been purged with Julian. They looked at me as I entered. Some looked resentful, others looked desperate. Judge Harrison sat at the head of the table. He nodded to me. "Mr. Thorne," a woman in a grey suit said. She was the CFO. "We are currently losing $4 million an hour in market valuation. We need a statement. We need to tell the market that the veto was a misunderstanding." I threw the Constitution onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped in front of her. "No misunderstandings," I said, my voice steady. "The veto stands." "But Mr. Thorne," she stammered, "we cannot survive this. We have inventory to move. We have quarterly targets." "Forget the targets," I said. I walked around the table, looking each of them in the eye. "Here is the new reality. We are liquidating the mass production lines. We are selling the automated factories. We are closing the overseas assembly plants. That's suicide, a man shouted. That shrinks us by 90%. Good, I said. We were too big. We were bloated. We are going back to the original model. Thorne Sons will produce 500 watches a year. Not 50,000, 500. The room went silent. They looked at me like I was insane. We will rehire the master craftsmen Dad fired, I continued. We will use the original molds. We will price them accordingly. If a customer wants a Thorne, they wait 2 years on a list. We don't sell convenience anymore. We sell perfection. And the shareholders? The CFO asked weakly. They will revolt. Let them sell, I said. Take the company private. Buy back the shares at the bottom. If you don't like it, resign. The door is there. I pointed to the exit. No one moved. They were sharks, but they were sharks who had just seen a bigger predator. They knew I held the legal card. The veto gave me absolute control over the brand. Without the brand, they had nothing. Fine, the CFO whispered. We shrink. One more thing, I said. Where is Julian? The room grew uncomfortable. The CFO looked down at her papers. Julian is unavailable, she said. Where is he? I repeated. He's at the penthouse, Judge Harrison said softly. The police are waiting for a warrant to seize his assets. He's refusing to leave. I took the elevator to the penthouse. It was a private lift, keyed only to the CEO's biometric data. Marcus had overridden the lock for me. The doors opened into a sprawling apartment that overlooked the entire city. It was decorated in white leather, chrome, and glass. It was cold, sterile, and expensive. The place was a wreck. Vases were smashed on the floor. A painting, a genuine Warhol, had been slashed down the middle. Clothes were scattered everywhere. It looked like a hurricane had passed through. A hurricane named Julian. I found him on the terrace. He was sitting on the edge of a white lounge chair, still wearing his tuxedo pants from the night before, though his shirt was unbuttoned and stained with wine. A bottle of scotch sat on the floor next to him, empty. He was staring out at the city, the wind whipping his messy hair. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. I wondered when you'd come, he said without turning around. His voice was slurred, thick with alcohol and defeat. Came to gloat? Or did you come to push me off the ledge? I walked out onto the terrace. The wind was strong up here. I'm not here to gloat, Julian. You should, he laughed. A bitter, jagged sound. You won. The prodigal son returns, the hermit king. He turned to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles. Do you know how much I owe, Elias? I leveraged everything. The cars, the house, my shares. I bet it all on the Legacy 2.0. I thought if I made enough money, Dad would finally shut up. Dad is dead, Julian, I said. He never died, Julian shouted, throwing his glass against the glass railing. It shattered into dust. He was always in my head. Not good enough, Julian. Focus, Julian. Why can't you be more like Elias? I froze. He never said that. He ignored me. He left me in a shed. Julian shook his head, tears streaming down his face. You idiot. He didn't leave you in a shed. He put you in his sanctuary. Do you know what he told me when I was 12? I asked him to teach me how to use the lathe. He said, "No, you have clumsy hands, Julian. You're a talker. Go talk. Leave the making to Elias." Julian slumped back into the chair. He designated our roles when we were children. You were the creator, I was the salesman. I hated him for it. I wanted to create. I wanted to make something real. But he wouldn't let me touch the tools. I stared at my brother. For decades, I had thought I was the outcast. I thought I was the one being punished. But Julian had been banished from the soul of the family, just as much as I had been banished from the wealth. We were both victims of a genius who cared more about gears than sons. I didn't know, I said softly. It doesn't matter now. Julian wiped his face with his sleeve. I'm going to prison. Fraud. Embezzlement. I cooked the books to hide the losses from the R&D department. Mom already called her lawyers. She's claiming she knew nothing. She's feeding me to the wolves. Isabella is a survivor, I said. She's a shark, Julian corrected. He looked at me, his eyes suddenly lucid. Elias, the cabin. What about it? I sold the land, he said. Not the company, me. I sold the deed to a developer 3 days ago to cover a margin call. The paperwork is in my safe. My stomach dropped. You sold Blackwood Ridge? I thought it was just dirt, Julian whispered. I didn't know about the vault. The developer? He's not like Salinger. He's mob connected. He doesn't care about vetoes or constitutions. He wants the land for a casino. If he finds out what's underneath, he'll gut it, I finished. He'll melt the molds down for scrap. You have to go back, Julian said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a combination code. This is for the safe in the wall. The deed is there. If you can get it before the police raid this place, maybe you can find a loophole. Or maybe you can burn it. He held the paper out to me. His hand was shaking. I took it. Our fingers brushed. It was the first time we had touched without violence in 20 years. Why are you helping me? I asked. Julian looked at the empty Scotch bottle. Because you were right. The watch was fake. I knew it. I didn't want to hear it. He looked up at me. Fix it, Elias. Fix the company. I couldn't. What will you do? I asked. I'll wait for the police, he said. It's time I stopped running. I looked at him one last time. He wasn't the villain anymore. He was just a broken gear, ground down by friction. Goodbye, Julian, I said. Goodbye, watchmaker, he whispered. I opened the safe. I found the deed. It was signed, but not yet countersigned by the county clerk. It was in legal limbo. If I could get to the county office before the developer filed his copy, I could block the transfer. But first, I had to secure the cabin. I left the tower and drove. I took a company car this time, a modest sedan from the fleet. I drove fast, leaving the city behind. The sky was turning grey again. A storm was coming. I reached Blackwood Ridge in the late afternoon. The yellow police tape was still on the door, but the padlock had been cut. My heart hammered. Had the developer arrived? I ran inside. The cabin was empty. But it felt different. The air was disturbed. I went to the hatch. The boards were moved. I climbed down into the vault. It was silent. The molds were still there, but someone was sitting at the workbench. It wasn't a developer. It wasn't a mobster. It was Isabella. She was sitting on the stool, illuminated by the single battery lantern I had left behind. She was wearing a trench coat over her designer dress. She was holding one of my father's journals. Isabella, I said, stepping off the ladder. She didn't look up. He wrote about me, she said softly. Her voice echoed in the concrete chamber. I didn't think he ever wrote about anything but metal. I walked closer. She looked diminished. The Ice Queen facade was melting in the damp air of the underground. He wrote that I was necessary friction, she read from the page. Isabella keeps the world away so I can work. She is the case that protects the movement. She is hard, cold, and essential. She closed the book. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry, but they were filled with a strange, haunted look. He didn't love me, she said. He used me, just like he used you, just like he used Julian. We were all just parts of his machine. He loved the work, I said. That was the only way he knew how to love. And now the work is all that's left, Isabella said. She stood up. She looked around the room at the millions of dollars worth of molds. Julian told me about the deed. The developer is coming, Elias. His men are on their way. They aren't coming to build a resort. They are coming to loot. How do you know? Because I sold them the information, she said simply. I stopped. The anger flared up instantly. You what? Yesterday, she said, before the gala, I hedged my bets. If Julian failed, I sold the location of the hidden assets to a salvage crew. I didn't know it was this. I thought it was gold bars. You sold us out, I hissed. Again. I survived, she snapped. That's what I do. But... She paused. She looked at the Master Chronometer in my pocket. Seeing what you did on that stage, seeing the weeping lion, she reached into her purse. I tensed, ready for a weapon. She pulled out a document. It was the countersigned copy of the land transfer, the one the developer needed to finalize the theft. I intercepted the courier, she said. It cost me my last favor with the senator. She held the document over the flame of the Bunsen burner on the bench. What are you doing? I asked. I'm resigning, she said. She dropped the paper into the flame. We watched as the deed curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The sale was void. The land was mine. Why? I asked, stunned. You don't do anything for free. Isabella watched the ashes float to the floor. Arthur told me once that the only thing you can't buy is time. I wasted 30 years building a fortune for a son who hates me and a husband who didn't care. She buttoned her coat. She looked at me, and for the first time I saw respect in her eyes. Not affection, but respect. You have his hands, Elias, she said. Don't make his mistakes. Don't die in this hole alone. She walked past me to the ladder. Isabella, I called out. She paused. Where will you go? Paris, she said. I have a small apartment there, and a lot of regrets to categorize. She climbed the ladder and disappeared. I heard her heels clicking on the floorboards above, then the slam of the cabin door, then the sound of her car driving away. I was alone in the vault. The ashes of the deed lay on the floor. I had saved the land. I had saved the company. I had neutralized the family. But the silence was deafening. I sat down at the bench. I pulled out the Master Chronometer. It was still ticking. Tick, tock. I looked at the journal Isabella had left. I opened it to the last page. My father's handwriting was shaky here, written perhaps days before he died. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, the mechanism worked. But the machine is not the point. The perfection is not the point. I spent my life trying to make time perfect. I failed. Time is messy. It skips, it drags, it hurts. The weeping lion is not crying for the time lost. He is crying because he is alone. Elias, if it is you, fix the watch. But then for God's sake, go upstairs. Open the door. Let someone in. I stared at the words. Let someone in. I had spent my whole life trying to get into this vault. Now I was here, the king of the underground, the master of the molds. And I realized my father hadn't left me a sanctuary. He had left me a lesson. The watch was a test. But the vault was a trap. If I stayed here, I would become him. I would become a ghost in a machine. I closed the journal. I put the watch in my pocket. I grabbed the lantern. I didn't look back at the molds. They would be there tomorrow. They would be there for the next 100 years. I climbed the ladder. I stepped out into the cabin. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the room. It was beautiful. Imperfect, fleeting, and beautiful. I walked to the front door and threw it open. I sat on the porch steps. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Text. The board agreed. We are private. We are starting over. When are you coming back? I looked at the text. Then I looked at the trees. I typed a reply. Text. I'm coming. But first, I need to make a stop. I stood up. I wasn't just going to the factory. I was going to the police station. I was going to visit my brother. I couldn't save him from the law, but I could sit with him. I could be the one thing our father never was. I could be present. The county detention center was a grey box made of concrete and misery. It smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I sat on a metal bench in the visitation room, my hands resting on the cold steel table. The ticking of the clock on the wall was loud, an electric clack-clack that lacked any soul or rhythm. It was just counting down the minutes of confinement. The heavy door buzzed. Julian walked in. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit. It was too big for him. His hair, usually styled to perfection, was flat and unwashed. He looked thinner, but the most striking change was his eyes. The frantic, desperate gleam was gone. The arrogance was gone. In their place was a strange, hollow calm. He sat down opposite me. He didn't look at the guard. He looked at me. You came, he said. His voice was raspy. I said I would, I replied. I didn't believe you, Julian admitted. He looked at his hands, hands that had never held a tool, hands that had only signed checks and swiped screens. My lawyer says I'm looking at 5 years, minimum. Fraud, embezzlement, insider trading. They have a spreadsheet of my life, Elias. It turns out my life fits into a very small Excel file. 5 years is a long time, I said. Is it? Julian let out a short, dry laugh. I spent 30 years in a prison, Elias. I was in a prison of expectations. I had to be richer than Dad. I had to be smarter than you. I had to be faster than the market. In here, I don't have to be anything. I just have to wake up. He leaned forward. Did you save it? The company? We're smaller, I said. We sold the tower. We moved back to the original brick factory in the district. We only make 300 watches a year now. The waiting list is closed until 2027. Good, Julian nodded. Good. There was a silence between us. It wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two soldiers who had fought on opposite sides of a war that was finally over. I reached into my pocket. I wasn't allowed to bring anything in, but the guard at the front desk was an old man who owned a vintage Thorne watch. I had fixed it for him in the lobby in 5 minutes. He had looked the other way. I slid a small object across the table. It wasn't a watch. It was a raw brass movement plate. It was unfinished, rough edges, no gears, just the foundation. What is this? Julian asked, picking it up. It's a blank slate, I said. I'm setting up a program at the factory. for ex-convicts, teaching them precision mechanics. It helps with focus. It helps with patience. Julian looked at the brass plate. He ran his thumb over the rough metal. "You think I can learn?" he asked softly. "Dad said I had clumsy hands." "Dad was wrong about a lot of things," I said. "Your hands are fine, Julian. They were just holding the wrong things. When you get out, there's a bench waiting for you. It's in the back near the window. The light is good there." Julian gripped the brass plate tight. His knuckles turned white. He looked down, and I saw a single tear splash onto the metal. He didn't wipe it away. He let it sit there, a testament to the friction finally breaking him open. "Thank you, brother," he whispered. "I'll see you in 5 years," I said. "Don't be late." I stood up and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew he was still sitting there, holding on to the future I had just given him. 6 months later. The seasons changed. The leaves on Blackwood Ridge turned from green to gold, then to a stark, beautiful brown. The snow came, burying the cabin in silence. And then the spring melted it away, revealing the earth again. I didn't live in the vault anymore. I had renovated the cabin. I kept the rough, rustic exterior. I liked the scars. But the inside was warm. I installed a proper kitchen. I put in a wood-burning stove that didn't smoke. And I built a new workshop. Not underground, but in the main room, facing the window where the morning sun hit the hardest. I was no longer the hermit. The keeper of the time had become something of a local legend, a recluse genius who saved a heritage brand. But I didn't care about the articles in the magazines. I threw them in the fire. I cared about the work. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was filled with the scent of pine and coffee. I sat at my bench, the sun warming my back. On the velvet pad in front of me sat the Master Chronometer. It had stopped. It happened 3 days ago, at exactly noon. The hands had locked. The balance wheel had ceased its rhythmic swing. I had panicked at first. I had opened the case, ready to fix it, ready to dive back into the complexity of the detent escapement and the fusee chain. But then I saw it. Inside the movement, a tiny gear, the one that drove the perpetual calendar, had sheared off. It wasn't an accident. It was a design feature. My father had built a kill switch into the watch. It was designed to run for exactly 40 years from the date of its creation. 1984 to 2024. It died on my birthday. I sat there for a long time, staring at the broken gear. At first, I didn't understand. Why build a masterpiece only to have it commit suicide? Why create the perfect standard if it was destined to fail? Then I remembered the journal. Time is messy. It skips. It drags. My father knew that technology would evolve. He knew that materials would get better. He knew that if I kept worshipping this watch forever, I would never build anything new. I would be a curator, not a creator. The Master Chronometer wasn't a perpetual king. It was a regent. It was meant to hold the throne until I was ready to take it. It stopped, so I would have to start. I didn't fix it. I closed the case back. I placed it in a small glass dome on the shelf, next to a picture of my mother. It was done. Its watch had ended. I turned back to the bench. In the vise sat a new movement, my design. It was simpler than my father's. It didn't have 1,000 parts. It had 150. But they were arranged in a way that reduced friction to almost zero. I used a silicone hairspring, a modern material my father hated, but one that was impervious to magnetism. I used a new alloy for the case that warmed to the skin temperature. And on the bridge, I didn't engrave a weeping lion. I engraved a phoenix. Not rising, but resting. A bird that had already burned and was now content to just be. The door to the cabin opened. Marcus walked in. He didn't knock anymore. He was technically the COO of Thorne Sons, but he spent more time up here fishing in the creek than he did in the office. "Coffee's on," I said, not looking up from the loop. "You have a visitor," Marcus said. He sounded amused. "I don't see visitors, Marcus. You know the rules. 2-year wait list." "She's not on the list," Marcus said. I turned around. Standing in the doorway was a young woman. She was about 25. She wore a backpack and hiking boots that were covered in mud. She held a large, worn-out sketchbook in her hands. She looked nervous, but her eyes were fierce. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked. "Just Elias," I said. "Who are you?" "My name is Sarah," she said. "I walked here from the train station. It took 3 hours." "You could have taken a cab," I said. "I wanted to see the land," she replied. "I wanted to see where the veto happened." She walked forward and placed the sketchbook on the table. "I'm not a watchmaker," she said. "I'm an artist. But I saw the video of the weeping lion, and I drew this." She opened the book. It was a sketch of a clock face. But the numbers weren't numbers. They were scenes. The 12 was a mountain. The 3 was a city. The 6 was a prison cell. The 9 was a workbench. And in the center, instead of hands, there were 2 figures reaching for each other. "I call it the human time," she said. "Because machines don't care about seconds. People do." I looked at the drawing. It was raw. It was imperfect, but it had soul. It reminded me of the sketches my father used to make in the margins of his technical journals. The doodles he hid from the world. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because I want to learn how to make it move," Sarah said. "I don't want to make watches that just tell time. I want to make watches that tell stories. And they say you're the only one who knows the difference." I looked at Marcus. He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "She has good hands, Elias. I saw her sketching outside, steady as a rock." I looked at the Master Chronometer on the shelf. The dead king. Then I looked at the blank movement in the vise. The new beginning. My father had locked me out. He had made me earn my place through silence and isolation. I could do the same to her. I could tell her to go away, to study physics, to come back in 10 years. That was the Thorne way. But I wasn't Arthur Thorne. I stood up. I walked over to the spare stool, the one I had placed there months ago, unconsciously waiting for someone to fill it. I pulled the stool out. "Sit down," I said. Sarah's eyes widened. "Really?" "Don't get excited," I warned, putting my loop back on. "First, you're going to learn how to file a screw head flat. It will take you 3 days. Your fingers will bleed. You will want to quit." "I won't quit," she said, dropping her backpack and sitting down immediately. "We'll see," I said. "Rule number 1, we don't rush. The watch is finished when it decides it's finished." "Rule number 2, Marcus chimed in from the kitchen. The coffee must be black." I smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that felt easy on my face. I handed Sarah a file and a piece of steel. "Show me what you can do," I said. As she began to work, the sound of the file rasping against the metal filled the room. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the same sound I had made 30 years ago in my father's study. But this time, the door wasn't locked. The window was open. The sun was shining. I picked up my tweezers and went back to my phoenix. The master chronometer was silent on the shelf, its duty done. But the room was loud with life. I thought about the forgotten detail that had started this whole war. The detail wasn't the veto. It wasn't the hidden vault. It wasn't the seal of the weeping lion. The detail my family had forgotten. The detail even my father had almost forgotten until the very end. Was that a watch is not a machine that captures time. It is a machine that reminds us that our time is limited. And because it is limited, it is precious. My father spent his time building a legacy. Isabella spent hers building a fortune. Julian spent his chasing a ghost. I looked at Sarah struggling with the file, her tongue poking out in concentration. I looked at Marcus laughing at a joke in the newspaper. I was finally spending my time living. Tick. The new watch on my desk took its first beat. Tock. It was strong. It was steady. It was mine. Good start, I whispered to the machine. Now keep going. Outside, the wind rustled the trees of Blackwood Ridge, a sound that had been there for centuries and would be there for centuries more. The time of the Thornes would pass, just like everything else. But for now, in this warm, dusty cabin, every second counted. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the alarm going off.